All right, in terms of the basics of the debate, then speaking times, unless something radical has changed in the rules between round 1 and round 2, will be up to 7 minutes. They'll be spelled, well, I'll try and put things in the timestamps in the chat at 1, 6, and 7. POIs can and should be offered between 1 and 6. We will default to using POIs in the chat. If you have a particular preference, it is another way. Please state that at the start of your speech. Otherwise, we'll just use the chat. I sometimes forget to put the timestamps in there, so please make sure you're also timing yourself and timing other speeches too. And otherwise, just keep your microphones off during other people's speeches or when you're not speaking. Without any further ado then, let's get the show on the road. So the motion before the House today is this House prefers the franchise model to the qualifier model for esports leagues. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to begin the debate. Here.
Okay, can you hear me? Cool. So 3, 2, 1. We, as OG, bring you 2 points why we think that the franchise model is better than the qualifier model. The first one is that we think that this model is more inclusive and include more teams and provide more opportunities for the minority teams to participate in the tournaments. And the second argument will be about the better equity rules for everyone during these tournaments. So first argument, we think that actually this model is more inclusive for the 2 reasons. The first one, notice that in a qualifier model, your opportunity to be a good team is highly based on your starting position. For example, the amount of money that you already get from the sponsor, the popularity that you already have in order to get a specific invite from the certain company that organizes the tournament. You need to get through a lot of tournaments, qualifications, etc., which is definitely make it worse for the teams that are not as popular or not as good already. We compare it to the model where you need just to play good enough and you will always have an opportunity to participate just because you have your regional league or a league where you always have a spot if you meet a certain criteria. And we think that actually in this system, you as a team have a space, a safe space, an opportunity to develop, to grow, to make your skills better and actually inevitably become a relatively good team. But the second reason, we think that in the qualifier model, the cost of the mistake is very high. If you're a young team, you're likely to lose your first tournament, as it will always happen during the debates also. So you will be on the bottom of the tab, you will be the last team in the table, etc. And we think that chance for you to become a better team is actually gone because, for example, the sponsors or the company who organizes this tournament wouldn't invite you because they just understand that they miss the hype, you miss their chance, miss your chance, and you're a very weak team. On the comparison, we think that the model with the franchise model always give you an opportunity, the safe place where you always be on the tournament. You always have an opportunity to play and you're not affected by this model. I take the CO.
Invitations only apply in major tournaments. Like obviously there are still regional events that are more accessible.
Definitely, but we think that also we have some events that are more accessible, but we should compare things there. And also we think that even if we have a lot of tournaments where you don't have an invitation, you still need to go through a lot of qualifications more than in a comparison with the franchise model. And why we think that actually more inclusive environment is better. First reason, we think that for a lot of people, this sport is the only sphere for their realization. Why it is so? So, for example, they can live in not very developed areas and not very good economic opportunities, and this is the only social ladder that they could use, is the first reason. But the second reason is that, for example, because of their personal traits, this kind of development could be better for them. Because, for example, they're introverts, they prefer this online gaming, they put all of this life in this in the gaming. So, for example, for them is the only opportunity to prosper, to be a better person, etc. But also, we think that at the end of the day, it makes the game better. Just because we proved you that there will be more teams in our system, that these teams initially become more competitive, just because they're from the weak teams have an opportunity to grow to a better teams. We think it's actually better because the tournament with more teams is more competitive. The tournament where you actually have a young blood for example, who can compete the some old leaders. It makes the game better, for example, for our audience, for people who watch this game on streams, etc. So we think that we can see here a clear benefits not only for the gamers but also for people who watch the streams, who are a fan of cybersport, etc. But the second argument why we think that equity rules are better on our side of the house. First reason, in the franchise model, you have the very specific responsible figure, the certain central authority that you could blame if everything goes wrong on your tournament. For example, if someone insults someone, or if there is a kind of other case where you need to apply equity rules. On a comparison, in the qualifier model, where you have a lot of sponsors, where you have a lot of companies who organize their own tournaments, sometimes you do not actually know who to blame, or risks to lose their audience are higher when you apply such equity rules, just because you have a lot of tournaments, and for example, the audience could choose to leave your tournament and choose the other one. So, or for example, you can just made one tournament, there were an accident there, and just everybody forgets about this just because you do not have a consistent league. The second argument is that you have more consistent teams and people you meet regularly there. Every participant, like almost every participant you meet in the next tournament, they will play like within a year, within 2 years, etc. And we think that there are two reasons why it is easier to control and apply equity rules there. So firstly, it is easier to make people responsible for their actions. For example, to punish them when you have a very unified league with the certain central rules, because you can actually threat them with punishment. On a comparison with the qualified model, they will leave the tournament, do not participate, and just go to the other tournament where these equity rules are not applied. But the second reason, we think it is actually easier to negotiate, because you have a very stable amount of players, you have a central authority, and all of these bureaucratic procedures with applying certain equity rules are relatively easier on our side of the house, because it's relatively easier to apply them like from the central authority. Why we think it is actually very important? Firstly, the very clear impact. Less people are offended, insulted, less psychological traumas, etc. We think that it is already important in this debate. However, we think that actually these very famous players are usually used as a role models for people who are just playing casually this game, and they can, so to say, use some patterns from them. So if we see the situation where some player insulted other player, and he is not, we don't have any rules, and he is not affected by any authority for doing so, the probability of other players to do the same things are very high. On our side of the house, where these equity rules are applied better and we control this behavior, the probability of this very inadequate role model to be in the mind of the game, of the usual gamers who just watch the streams and think that these players are their role models is less. And why we think it is important? Because it directly affects the comfort during the game, it directly affects the people's psychological traumas, etc. So for all of these reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now I'd invite the opposition leader up to begin the case for OO. Here.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. I will begin my speech. And yeah, I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so yeah, we could all agree that what we should fighting for is, first thing is the face of the esport, and for the fans and for the players here. And I would first off want to refute some of the points that the opening government has made. And the first thing they said that having a franchise model makes team more accessible, as more teams can be sponsored and to participate in different leagues. But the thing is, this is the precise factor that makes the franchise model not accessible to everyone, because they are dependent on the money and the popularity of the franchise. And if you are from like a not so popular franchise, people won't watch you anyway. And then, but on our case, then the smaller teams with their performance, if they do well, they can make it to bigger leagues and get more investment on themselves. And then the second, the second point that OG made is that the cost of the mistakes, it's very high. And then if you lose, then you can like hit the bottom, and then they will who to blame, they're gonna punish the corporations and the investors. So the thing is, you have many matches and you can bounce back, because why? Because like I said before, it's not accessible, and there are only some teams that are constantly competing, and even if you're doing bad, then there's still many chances for you to bounce back, right? And then when we are doing punishing corporation and investors, like OG's case, then it would be, it would indirectly affect the players. And we can see this, in many various example of, TSM, the League of Legends franchise, where they're punishing the players and they are putting the players through long hours of training and mistreating them in order to keep a better image of their franchise. And then you said that for the qualifier model, when they are losing at one regional league, they can move to another one. That is precisely what happens in your case as well, right? Because when people they do bad in a franchise, they can just move to another franchise, or even move to a region where it is not as competitive. And that is the reason why I'll say that this happens to both sides of the party, and it doesn't make your argument better than ours. And so before moving on to our side, I would move on to say the benefits of our side. The first thing, like I said before, is accessibility. The esport now will be based on skills, and by performing well in the lower leagues, different teams, they can move on to the big leagues and attract more investments, which is both benefit for the esport by making it more competitive, as well as benefit the players in the team, because they are getting more exposure, they can get more leagues, and then they get more investments at the same time. And then on the point of making the esport more competitive, then regulated teams can be more determined and pose more challenge to the others. Whereas in the franchise model, they can do whatever they want because they won't be relegated no matter what, right? We have the real life example of football. In football, many teams that are at risk of relegation actually perform better because they are being pressured by the league. And also we can see many teams from the lower leagues participating and even winning the upper leagues, which makes the game much more exciting. This case being Leicester City winning the Euro Championship, the Premier League. And then okay, this is also for the investors as well. You can there will be investors who are more willing to invest in good playing teams, and they will bring more benefit to the investors because they have a wider range of teams to choose from. And before moving on, I'd like to receive POI from CG if you guys have any.
In the qualifier model, your argument is that small teams will start to win, and this is where all of your impacts flow from. Why will small teams win insofar as they have fewer resources and lesser time to practice?
Well, they have a lot of other leagues where they get exposures, like I said, whereas in the other team, they get even in your franchise model, they don't even get exposures at all, right? Because we're giving them opportunities for them to improve and for them to spar themselves with different other teams and to move up in the ladder. And for the fans, they will have it will be much better for the fans because they will get to see more leagues, and they will get to see even regional teams. And like more regional teams and get get exposed to different teams, whereas like I said, in the franchise model there are only so many teams, and it will be keep like that all over the ages. And so moreover, the fans will be more attached to a team, the diehard fans, because they have been watching them from their infancy, right? From the team when they were just starting off as a small one, and watch them further move into the big leagues. And this is the same, principle where they may have like regional teams, and they have regional fans root for them, which is the case that we had in football. And I don't see like why it's going to be different in the esports. So with that, I'd like to conclude that our qualify model brings benefit to the esport by making it more competitive, and brings benefit to the small teams by giving them more exposure and helping them attract more investors just by performing well. We're also bringing the fans benefit by pulling their attentions to different leagues, and also giving them more attachment to their team. And with that, conclude my speech.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now I'd invite the Deputy Prime Minister up to conclude the case for opening government. Here.
Can you hear me? Cool. Okay. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. First of all, let's interact with the POI of CEO. They talk about the regional tournaments which exist on both sides of the house. So of course, however, the regional tournaments in their system, they are literally meaningless, because you cannot qualify to the bigger ones just competing into these competitions, because all attention are connected with the huge competitions. It means that there is less incentives to create regionals, because all the strong teams and all the attention will be on cool and huge and big tournaments. So that is why the ability to play like every year and to practice is much less anyway on their side of the house. So because we compare like the high level of regional tournaments with the low level of regional tournaments, and having this kind of private stuff. Okay, let's now deal with the money argument from the opening opposition. Some of rebuttal will be included in my case. So they say that smaller teams will have incentives on their side of the house. We say that small teams won't get any incentives to be invested, because you need to become. Look, you are an investor, and you know that if you invest to the team needs to go through 100 DPC competitions in order to go to the one prestige tournament. It is really risky active, and it means that there is no incentive to risk in that way. Also, if you fail, you are trash. If you just fail on one big tournament, it means that you are done with that. You will never have an invite from these organizers if your team was boring, if your team were failed, and things like that. However, in centralized system, you still have a kind of a league sharing, like money, as in football, any sports. You have league sharing to support these small clubs and make them alive still. Okay, let's go to the arguments money in cybersport. Look how it looks on their side of the house. The investment in the cybersport teams is very high risk active, because you can lose literally everything because of lots of things that can happen in the big tournaments. For example, the great lose, the team scandal, changing of the criteria of the organizer. That organizer will just change the criteria to invite teams. So it means that there is no ability to gain money, to gain profit from team you are invested in, because you are not able to run ads, because you are not able to win the competition. It means there is literally no money for you as an investor and no money for the team. Lack of incentive to invest there. So it means that there is lots of, and there is 2 impacts here. So the 3 teams are just destroyed, or they became much less because they do not have like enough money to psychologists, to the training and things, to the participations on the offline tournaments and things like that. So, or these undertrained teams just will have like less cool game, less beautiful game and things like that. On our side of the house, we guarantee you that you will always be a part as an investor, guarantee you for an investor that you will always be a part of league. You will always be a part of this media community. You will always have to, you will always be able to run ads. You will always will have an access to the league budget, etc., etc., etc. This basically means there is much more incentives to put money into the cyber sports teams. There are two impacts from here. First, it is just a beautiful game. It's just it is just much more interesting. It is just much more fast and things like that. So it's very interesting to see. So the second, you are able to scout, for example, talents from other countries because you have that amount of money. You can scout the talents from India. You can scout the talents from like Central Asia. You can scout the talents from other continents and provide them with this kind of with the ability to use this social ladder when all teams basically can do it. On their side of the house, only very privileged teams who are historically good just because they were in Dota since the Dota was started, only they are able to do that kind of things. Second argument, extreme disbalance in region. South America has just one team per region because of the system they provide, because the big tournaments, the organizers of these these big tournaments, they are just not interested in the representation of the teams, because the tournament not inviting teams from the particular regions just because the level of their game is a bit less. Why? Just because the historical things, they just started to play this game much later. So they do not just, it means that they do not have enough tournaments to practice, and there is no any capacity to increase their skills for them just because of this kind of historical things. On our side of the house, they have the current league and they are able to participate and they are able to qualify not because of their image but because of their skills, and they have this kind of regular practice. We believe that sport have to stand on the values of the inclusivity, and all teams have to be represented despite the regional factor and things like that. On their side of the house, the slots that are claimed to like that these teams can fill, that slots filled of a bunch of the boomers who just went to the internationals just because they were good, like literally 5 years ago. It literally eliminates the competition principles just because they use their previous achievements to qualify to qualify there, so we believe that it's unfair and it decreased the amount of like cool things that are happening on the tournament just because you cannot just see very cool game with the professionals and things like that. So we believe that on our side of the house we have much money and much practice for the small like teams, and much more incentives for them to qualify and abilities for them to qualify to the bigger tournaments, which leads to representation. And also we have more incentives for the investors to invest to the cyber sport because it's just much more safe for them. It is not risky active, which depend on 1 million factor on their side of the house. Because you cannot just overthrow the image of other like very big team. However, on the other side of the house, you can just step by step climbing the ladder of your league, then qualify and be safe even if you do something wrong. For all these reasons, we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
There you rush that speech. Tonight, welcoming up the Deputy Opposition Leader to conclude top half of today's debate. You're here.
Am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Just give me one quick second. I'll take POIs only in the chat, so please don't interrupt me. That's really annoying. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think there's a fundamental mischaracterization on the side proposition on what our case looks like, right? Because I think a lot of arguments they talk about are actually the problems of franchisee systems, right? And given that one of the main premises for all their positive point to stand up is that like small teams can enter big franchisees, Like they never show us any mechanism of how small teams are even getting into big franchisees, because specifically these franchisees are owned by like A, game developers, and B, like the teams in that franchisee. Like we never see like why they would be able, small teams would be able to enter, because the motion also states it's generally static with maybe some change here and there, right? Like, which is in reality like almost always static, except like maybe adding one person, right? Because understand there's more likelihood for gatekeeping by the big teams that are there, like just them generally gatekeeping because they own the shares. They can stop any small team from entering, like money games, for example, like big money corporations, big money teams, like just investing money and preventing anyone from entering, and bureaucracy, right? Like it's essentially a form of dictatorship that doesn't happen. On our side, you at least get accountability and a more dynamic system, because some teams will get promoted, some teams will get relegated, someone new will come. If you perform bad, at least someone else will get an opportunity. It's not going to be a static system. I think that's good because teams get an opportunity to enter, right? But before that, let's just do some like extraneous rebuttals, right? Like their first idea, like, oh, you fail, you're trash, right? Understand that first thing, like if you are able to win and get promoted to a big tournament, that is already good for you, because in your side, there's no way you can enter a big franchisee unless like you have like very big connections. So there's no way for you to get showcased, because like the way franchise system works is like, that's how MLB used to be until like 40 years ago. Like, is that like everyone's going to be just watching the big franchisee. That's literally where every attention is going to be. There's literally where all the money is going to be. There's literally where all the sponsors going to be, right? So understand like what essentially happens is like, it just stays like no one's going to watch the smaller franchisees. On our side, even if that is the case, even if we assume that like no one watches any sort of smaller tournaments or qualifiers, understand that if you get promoted once to a big tournament, or if you get promoted once to a big league, that gives you enough attention for you to attract sponsors, right? Which was not possible in your case. So even one appearance is enough for you to get like some sort of stability. You can see this example in like soccer, for example, teams like Levante coming in and like, you know, like not being big teams, entering and making it to like main sort of like La Liga, and then essentially like getting there more stably and not getting relegated again, because now they have money, and being a good team, they were able to invest it and work through it, right? So essentially one promotion is good enough. One invitation to big tournament is big enough. That doesn't happen on your side. You never get it like into like franchisees that are big enough, right? But also I understand like without that mechanism, it's like not even like just proven on their side, right? Okay. Now just comparing like, you know, the argument about like why investors are likely to like not like invest money in those sort of things, right? Understand it's actually still better for smaller teams on our side, right? Because their whole argument is, oh, investors are not going to make it because it's risky, your team might lose, right? But understand investors are now likely to invest in smaller teams because you can evaluate the price of their investment, right? Sure, you won't invest into bigger teams because they can move down. They might not get invited to the bigger tournament again. But now you have opportunity to invest in smaller teams because that's something that will only evaluate. Any small amount of investment, if a team qualifies somehow, is going to be big. And essentially they are going to invest more and more in lower leagues, which is essentially what happens in like status quo, right? Like you invest in smaller leagues, you invest in smaller teams. Even if they get invited to one big tournament, you get a huge return on your investment. So I think that's just good for smaller teams in general. That's good for accessibility on our side, right? Like that's clearly something that they cannot claim in that regard, right? Before I move on, I'll take a PY from CG.
Panel, they keep mentioning smaller teams as if this team is an individual unit we care about. It's the people in the team we care about. Why won't those people get opportunities on our side? You haven't explained this at all.
I think it depends on like mechanisms on like why you would get opportunities on your side, right? Understand essentially, even if team is not one big unit, a lot of opportunities on the teams depends on like the amount of investment you're getting in, the amount of popularity your team has. I think our mechanisms show that you get that at least on our side. You at least get some sort of exposure, even if like a lot of teams, even if 50% of the teams don't get, at least like you have a marginal delta of teams that are constantly statically moving, that constantly statically get attention. And I think that's just inherently good. Like that's just some sort of like dynamic sort of movement that happens on our side that doesn't happen in franchise system. You can clearly look at like how these systems work, right? But also like understand like you can easily like draw comparisons with like how things work in like soccer, right? Because I think that's a very clear model on like how essentially LOL people just started, CSGO people started like doing these sort of things, right? So understand like promotion, relegation, and competition and like doing well inherently creates value for sports itself and coheres with the spirit of competitive sport, right? Like you can essentially see even in the word trend shifted into qualifier format everywhere. MLB used to be like more like a franchisee, but now it's like more relegation team gets relegated to in that regard. Understand like soccer big giants literally tried to create a super league, which was essentially a franchisee where big teams like Real Madrid, Manchester City, and everyone would be playing, and people just booed it off because it was just so bad for sports, because these teams were just coming in and like just playing among themselves, and essentially it was going to be a just big money sort of move, right? So essentially understand people in general don't like these things. It's going to be bad for teams which play in bigger franchisee, but it's also not good for people. But understand like just to evaluate on my partner's point, right? Understand now when you have smaller, like a team who doesn't perform well, now they have chances of getting relegated, right? So imagine if I'm doing bad in a debate tournament and I essentially give up because now I have no chance to break, right? Like essentially that's what happens in franchisee. But in like at least with some form of relegation happening, now essentially I know, sure, I'm not breaking, but if I'm like the last 20 teams at Worlds, I might not make it to the next Worlds, right? I might not be even allowed to enter. That allows me to like compete more competitively, and it essentially makes the whole sports more fun. That's why you see Real Madrid losing to teams like Sociedad, who are like right on the edge of relegation. That's why you see like these sort of big upsets happening. We think that generally creates more value for sports, which itself is a competitive event, right? And finally, like better for fans because they can see their teams grow over time, like helps gain sports smaller team because of hard fighting spirit. My partner gave example of Leicester. Like essentially a smaller team doing good is like more people like to see underdogs win. I think that clearly creates value, even if you are a diehard fan. Like everyone enjoyed Leicester coming up and winning, right? And finally, like only on the idea of like just like franchisee protecting the interest of companies and investors, like we've given you enough reason, right? Like clearly more investments are going to happen on our side to smaller teams. Like I think it's much more brilliant opportunity for investors, but now that money is essentially going to smaller teams, which is really, really good on our side for smaller teams, very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Thank you to everyone on the top half. We'll now move to the government member to begin the closing half of today's debate. Here.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yep, you're all good.
Okay. I can't look at the chat, so please unmute and go ahead and interrupt me. I won't mind. It's perfectly fine. Just preferably one from opening opposition, and then I'll try to take one from closing opposition as well. Okay. Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. 2 extensions in member of government. First, consistency. Specifically, the best case of opening opposition still loses because it's unstable. The instability of this harms players as well as viewers. The second extension is specifically about abuse, framing why it's so constant and why we solve it on opening government's extension, like being better than OG, basically. So, first of all, let's explain why OG does not actually explain the most crucial point of this debate, however. The opening half clash is about small teams and people who aren't very popular players. Opening government says they get better opportunities when they're in the league. OO says, no, they get better opportunities when they win tournaments. OO is out because first, often it's hard to assemble a bunch of good players into a good team, insofar as they only team with other people who are already good. So if you start off bad, you don't even get good teammates. Second of all, there's a giant skill gap. You don't immediately beat people who've been playing the game for years. If you start off, often you're just going to lose a lot of games, and opening government impacts then materialize. But third of all, it's specifically the RNG nature of sports, which is that often it depends on how well you perform each day, which means that yes, you might win once or twice, but that is the best case they get. We'll take it. It'll probably happen. Some small teams will win. But why will people get benefits on our side better? OG doesn't prove how scouting is much likely to be better off on our side. They don't prove that these people get into the league in the first place. So here's what we're going to do. First, note that the actual video game often has a ranked ladder. People can play in this video game, do really well, and if their scores are high, people scout them out and get them. Second, you still have local community tournaments. Just because there's a league for football doesn't mean I don't play football in my school or tournaments aren't held in high school. So often that's where people go for scouting. But third, it's because there's often things like online streaming, which means that people can showcase their talents in a way that gets them attention on Twitch or so on, which means if they get cool plays and compilations, people can see that they're good and get them in a team. The incentive is simple. You want to win, and inherently the league itself has a huge incentive to get good players because they want to make money. The cooler plays there are, the more people watch watch their show, the more likely they are to get good players. And finally, they don't want players getting complacent and lazy. They need to replace them, otherwise the players don't care. Hence, all of this means scouting is mechanized, and that means opening government's impact of minorities comes to closing government, and opening opposition's harm gets significantly mitigated on how minorities are better on their side. Now I'm going to flip the debate. First, what happens on stability on side opposition? Note that qualifiers mean that first, your income often comes from tournaments, which means that you are uncertain in terms of what money you're going to get. It does not matter if you are a good player, you still know that you only get that money if you win the tournament or if you do well enough to be considered relevant. Note what this means. If you don't get in the top 32, top 8, you get $50 or $100 for spending weeks or months of your time playing. Note the time trade-off here. This is often practicing for hours every day, which you could spend on doing work or actually trying to do well in terms of going to a tournament on your weekend, which often costs money and time in the first place. All of this means that your income is quite unstable on side opposition. But second, there's no economies of scale on side opposition. Every time a tournament occurs and there's different independent organizers, often there's startup costs. You need to find the same amount of computers. Again, you need to find a huge amount of people who can then bring their controllers and more people can play. Note this is important because in opposition's best case of many people playing, they have to bite this harm. The more people that play, the more equipment you need, the more people you need to organize them, the more logistics you need to handle, which means often it becomes more expensive to set up tournaments in the first place. But third of all, there's no consistent employment or organization because since there are many different tournaments, they happen once or twice every year, but many of these independent organizations, even the large ones, only have 1 or 2 events, right? Obviously, when you put them all together, they have it consistently every single weekend and so on. What this means is, yes, on-site opposition, there are tournaments every weekend. The difference is it's not from the same organization. Hence, you can't get employed. This is important. You often can't work in the organization as someone promoting the game and making it popular. You often can't work as someone who's organizing logistics because it's often done by different organizations which you need to build connections in. The impact of this is first, the tickets are more expensive, which means people often can't afford to go to these events in the first place and they can't enjoy the community that they've built. This is important because these players are often the most important ones. They've locked themselves into a certain video game that they like, and now they can't go to the thing that they care about the most, which is the community events. Note that going to something on your weekend often means that this is what you care about the most in your life. It's often a big part of your utility. When that becomes inaccessible and badly handled, it's often likely to harm you. But second, it makes the players feel like shit, which means the hardest workers are unlikely to get benefits on side opposition because unless they win every tournament, they have to instead continue to also do work. This is bad because it means that their consistent source of money is gone. Instead, they have to do work in their actual jobs, like become an engineer or something, which takes away time they can spend on practicing, which causes a compounding harm on opposition because they lose even more. And further, they themselves see psychologically that there's a lack of stability and don't see a future in this career. And so they back out even if they genuinely want to work in the first place. So only people with a financial cushion who can afford to spend this amount of time and money playing video games can actually be in there in the first place. We fix all of this before that quickly opening opposition.
Given on your side, this huge segregation, most people don't even get into the franchisees, at least on our side, this streaming and sponsorship, which is symmetrical, right? Engage on that.
You're literally just asserting that no one gets into the team on our side. I'm telling you that at the point where you can get scouted and people can check for your talents in a few tournaments, and then you get into an actual team, you're probably likely to be better off. You didn't even respond to OG. I don't think you're beating us. So why exactly does investment rise? Note that OG gives you some reasonable arguments, right? Which is, okay, you have a consistent source of revenue because there's lots of games or something. There's a few things that they don't mention. First, it's the viewership being concentrated, which is more important than opening government's reasons. At the point where there's a lot more viewers for one event, that's where you get sponsorships at all, because people are less willing to pay money when there's a few thousand viewers viewing independent local tournaments, or even if it's a few 100,000 viewers, it's not millions, which means you don't attract the big names. But second, and this is killing to opening opposition and to closing opposition, the developer has a huge amount of subsidization to give. Specifically, they can take losses for the short term, where they continue to expand their investment in the first place, and they cross-subsidize from other things that own them. So often you might have a company that is a game developer, which is a part of a larger company like say Microsoft, which makes other devices and electronics. This means often you get billions of dollars funding these large leagues instead of funding independent events that come from local companies that don't have this. What does this investment mean? It means stability and accountability. Why does it mean stability? First, it means more roles that you can actually get, which means consistent income for people who work as coaches, who work as promoters, which means people who care about the field actually get consistent money in the first place. But second, it means more money from consistent viewership because you build an actual community and you're likely to put effort into a small group of viewers, or a large group of viewers, as opposed to constantly competing with others, which means that you get more interest, more money that gets concentrated into the hands of a few leagues, which we think is a good thing because then they can use it to help their players in the first place. But third of all, obviously economies of scale in that like you can buy things more cheaply when you're a large company with lots of connections. This impacts a lot of opening government's abuse claims, because this means you have the money to afford people who can care about things like actually making sure no one gets abused. At the point this is true, note three things. First, there's legal liability, which is better. You're more likely to tell a player that you have abused someone because you're not scared of the lawsuit attacking you. This is more strong than OG's mechanism of many different tournaments. It's about the capacity, because in the best case of opposition, everyone has the capacity to stop abuse. But second of all, it means the franchise has a brand reputation to keep, which is often family friendly, because the developer itself cares about what families think, which means you're more likely to think of accountability and stopping players from abusing each other. All of this means you mechanize OG's abuse harms as well. Word closing comment.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to welcome the officer member up to begin the case for closing opposition. Here.
Hello, just want to confirm that I'm clear and audible. Okay, again, my name's Nicole. Pronouns are she, they, POIs in chat, but if I don't take you by 5, feel free to unmute. Okay, 3, 2, 1. I think that a large chunk of OG's case is simply saying that the game is going to be improved at the end of the day because there are more players now essentially fails. Because they don't really prove why accessibility is improved when you have a central authority and required to be bought off or sponsored or scouted by a private group or corporation before you even have access to the league. Even if they say that people have access to things like exposure through the leaderboards throughout all these tinier competitions, we think that the chances of success within that league is very minimal to begin with, because the odds are stacked against you when you're competing against nepotism babies or individuals who have a large array of resources for them to be able to drastically improve in a short period of time. These sentiments are further echoed by closing government, saying that the people are still going to inevitably play anyways because there are still smaller competitions existing. Like, even if the claim is true that more people are going to be able to penetrate the sphere and we improve things like accessibility, we question the chances of them winning or gaining anything from this opportunity, given the odds are stacked against them when they're competing against teams with a lot of funding, with top-of-the-line equipment, with high-speed internet and the best computers. But we also question CG, what exactly is the incentive of private entities to scout and support a small, well-performing athlete over someone who has already built up a name for themselves, over someone who you know will be able to skyrocket your agenda, your brand, and stuff like that, right? These clarifications are important because it directly tackles the premise of all of the benefits that you get on government bench promised to you and echoed by closing government as well, right? Which is contingent on more people being able to play and just generally a better experience for these players. Their case is also soft because they have to trade off the existence of smaller tournaments, or like the legitimacy of these smaller tournaments and the chances for one big league per region to be able to accrue, and for these things to be recognized by the rest of the industry and the community as something that's largely legitimate. I think the problem with OO is that they said that the franchise model is bad because it's inaccessible and competition based on qualifications are far better. But there's no mechanism exactly on how these things generally improve esports for its fans and players. They're outcome dependent on small teams being able to penetrate these things and winning. But even if they don't win, we say it's still fine, because the largest problem with the model and government isn't just the lack of opportunities that you're getting, but the fact that you have a central authority or body that imposes limitations on who is able to be seen as legitimate and who is able to compete in these teams. The main battle cry of exposure isn't enough coming from OO, because a stronger government team can simply say that there's no harm in letting inexperienced people join the league. You can easily scout these people and incentivize someone to sponsor us. There's an actual incentive for companies to scout smaller teams and breakout stars. But I think that there's CO is that it's a 1 in a million thing. If you're going to be scouted, then good, but that doesn't take away the fact that you deprive a large pool of people of these chances simply because you're trying to chase things like legitimacy using a central authority. Okay, quickly a few responses. CG says that scouting is better because there are
Okay, I think my partner disconnected. Let me just contact them.
Yeah, time was stopped at 3:20. I think she's back, maybe.
Hello.
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
that's right. We stopped the clock at 3:20. We were just about to start some explicit CG rebuttal, I think.
Okay. I'll set up my timer real quick. Okay, cool. Okay, restarting in 3, 2, 1. CG says that scouting is going to be mechanized and a systematic process because of these online streams and existence of smaller tournaments. But the difference is that legitimacy is contained in the spaces of these leagues that corporations and private groups are able to dominate. So smaller endeavors will forever be invalidated and seen as merely a stepping stone for these larger successes. Second, the problem isn't just accessibility, it's the fact that these people, these opportunities are going to be arbitrarily controlled by people with a profit incentive. And that's generally bad for individual athletes who simply want to play and find success in this industry. So what is exactly the incentive of these private entities to scout someone smaller, a well-performing athlete over someone who has already built up a name for themselves? That's a burden that they need to answer coming from CG, right? Okay, first case, a comparative evaluation of which model is generally better for the esports league. The premise here is simple. The franchise model depends on the approval and benevolence of corporations and private groups. This hurts the potential of esports to grow as an industry and the general well-being of athletes trying to engage in esports as well, right? Three structural problems on why a singular league with a central authority of the franchise model is simply bad, right? First, it manufactures a monolith of success. It's a very high risk, high reward thing. Like if you get scouted, then good for you. There's only one title each season that's counted as like the major achievement, the highlight of your career. I think this is bad because all the attention opportunities are concentrated on the people who have already proven themselves anyways. And we think the people with the most likelihood to win in these leagues anyways are people who already have connections, people who already have a wide array of resources at their disposal. So the benefits of innovation, accountability, and increased attention in sponsorship deals and success are likely to be isolated to the most privileged teams only, who always win anyways and already have the means to get better at their disposal. Secondly, there's greater barriers for entry. Like you need corporate backing before you even get into the league and even get to play in these things, right? The appeal for esports in status quo is how easy it is to access and get into. You just need the computer, strategy, learn the rules, and that's how you're able to compete in these things, right? Compared to traditional sports that operate using the franchise model, you have to go through a massive amount of training and recognition before you're able to get access to these chances. I think that they only apply the same problems to esports.
All right, I think she dropped out again.
I contacted them. Apologies for that.
Hello, can you hear us?
Hello.
Hello. All right, the clock was stopped at
Extremely sorry.
the clock was stopped at 5:50. You were talking about barrier to entry and cost, and we're talking about needing training at this point.
Okay, cool. I'll continue my timer. 3, 2, 1. In a qualifier model, you just need a shot at success, an achievement, or a chance to be able to prove yourself. So the players you're likely to get aren't just people with connections. These are people who actually want to play and actually want to try. But thirdly, there's controlled progress and opportunities. The problem with the central authority on the franchise model is that it's likely to be dominated by the most privileged people. The rules are likely to be self-serving. So values like account
She dropped out for everyone else as well.
Yep, they did.
Yeah, I can hear.
Can you hear us?
Yes, I'm here. Okay, I
Yeah.
think I'm at 6 minutes.
Yeah, we've got the 6:20. You just talked about the qualifying rules and shots of success, etc., being controlled.
Okay, cool. Restarting in 3, 2, 1. The people who are deciding these rules are the same people who proliferate the elitist and sexist notions that exist in the current esporting community. It's a lot less democratic. Now, why is this a value? As an industry, esports is generally young, so it's important that diverse pool of players are able to negotiate on these things, and you force them out of these discussions by creating a regional league. You depend on the benevolence of these companies, of these private groups. So even if they say that you get jobs, you get opportunities, these are still isolated among the top 1%. Okay, let's take government at their very best case and assume that we do get better legitimacy, better rules and recognition for players and esports, right? Even if that's true, and it does help with these two things, it trades off the accessibility and low barrier of entry and the diversity in esports competitions, because we need to question who's likely to win, who's likely to be scouted anyways, and whether or not these effects are likely to trickle down to the rest of the industry. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to welcome the government to conclude the government bench today. Here.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right, give me 1 second and I'll get started. All right, for POIs, just put them in the chat. I'll probably take opening op at around 5:30 or 5:40. So if you drop in the chat, I'll get to you. Cool. All right. I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. The issue of opening opposition is that they just give you a description of sport history and the psyche of the average sport fan that is non-unique to esport. So at the end of opening opposition, I'm still genuinely unsure why franchisees have no incentive to buy up smaller teams, for example, because surely if their argument was that there's an incentive to do so in football or futsal, because you want a positive first mover advantage, because your franchise will look super sexy if you win the next cup and you're the one that helped the underdog, then surely that incentive was symmetric, because there's still a starting point on our side of the house in which franchisees have an incentive to invest. If it was the case that fans have an arbitrary incentive to like teams on the basis of ideological purity or on the basis of geographic similarity or on the basis of like whatever the fuck their logo was, then surely that incentive existed symmetrically and therefore fans have an ability to find longing on both sides of the house. If it was the case that competition was something that mattered to individual tournaments and individual athletes, surely that was symmetric for all of the reasons Sharia also gave you, which is to say, A, probably it is better on our side because of the way in which scouting works, especially because opportunities existed on both sides of the house in community level events that were not part of this motion, or 2, because the skill of economic return and the extent of scrutiny you have is significantly higher. This is quite important in weighing against the top half in this debate, because the issue of opening government is that they just give you a case as to why the opposition side was bad, but did not actually build the counterfactual as to why they were better on their side. Sharia does this by explaining the mechanisms of scrutiny that were not just unique to big scale events, because if you go back to opening government's case, a lot of their argument just applied to big scale events and the way in which they work, but uniquely to the way of franchisees model and why you get higher degrees of accountability. What did Sharia say? The first thing Sharia proved was that you get higher degrees of investment because individuals who are privately investing trust the developers far more than random tournaments, especially because of the CO extension on the low barrier of entry. The reason why this was important is because all of opening government case is hinged on proving why you get more funding in the first place. We do so on our side by mechanizing the incentive calculus of individuals who invested, which means we're already one leg up against opening government. But the second thing Sharia says, and this is quite important, is why the concentration of viewership is often important. Because if opening up and closing up is right, that there's a low barrier of entry and you oftentimes have frequency and events, what that means is that the net sum of money you have going into the tournament or going into the event is always going to be decentralized. The reason why that was bad is because oftentimes then the decentralization of funds means that A, the average athlete gets paid significantly less, but B, you are unable to funnel that back into the event, which is probably important for all of opening opposition's analysis about why competition was important. So at this point in time, we have proven why when you have developers who are linked to the event, when you have a concentrated amount of audience who is viewing the event, you get higher degrees of money. But this is also importantly the accountability mechanism that opening government missed, because when you have an individual developer that sells merchandise that needs to be in charge of the entirety of the tournament, the extent of scrutiny placed on them is far higher for the reason that oftentimes A, they're the only ones with the capacity to change, so there's higher degrees of scrutiny, but B, they directly lose money and viewership because tournaments are always able to scapegoat individual game designers, whereas developers can't because they literally fucking made the game. So all of this allows us to be opening government quite comfortably. The reason why we'd be opening opposition therefore as well is because a lot of opening opposition outside of the frame already given you are just random assertions that aren't really explained. So opening opposition says gatekeeping happens. I'm genuinely not sure why that's not symmetric to tournaments if their analysis is that individual franchisees will buy up tournaments and lobby and do it in a way that allows for better teams to be robust. Surely that is probably going to be the same, if not worse, on their side when you have a tournament, for the reason that leagues are farly more consistent. Oftentimes what that means is that you have consistent engagement with a team, but on their side of the house, literally, you can just make sure that a really shitty team lose in the first round, and therefore you don't have any degree of accountability. Therefore, closing opposition says you have nepotism and that's bad, but surely that was far higher on their side of the house for the extent that decentralization and tournaments being ran by individuals not affiliated with the specific developer is far more likely going to lead to things like no accountability and lack of scrutiny. We proved the incentive for accountability, and that in and of itself was winning. Here's why we'd be opening government more conclusively. I'm going to bring Sharia's extension back here. There are 3 ways in which we win this debate from closing government. Number 1, opening up a government, as I pointed out earlier, lacks analysis. Here are the 3 ways in which we fill in that analysis, and we're going to weigh our material against op bench, therefore. Number 1, Sharia proves mechanisms as to how scouting works and how funding works. This mechanizes opening government because OG is contingent on proving this mechanism, because at best, they prove why there's an economic deficit on op, but not why there's a net economic gain on our side of the house, so we win the comparison, therefore. But second, and this is important, we're far more charitable in engaging with op bench to explain why op bench is going to be far worse. The reason why this was the case was because we told you, even in the best case of opening up and closing opposition, we won because of the internal harm that you dealt on average to the athlete. What happens on their side? A, you feel far higher degrees of disutility because of the uncertainty of not knowing when your next one was going to be, because oftentimes sports was RNG, because you do not know the condition, you do not know the opponent, you do not know the field, you do not know, for example, your bandwidth or whatever it is that necessarily you knew. But second of all, that leads to a fear of insecurity that you as an average athlete will feel, especially if CEO is right that these are young individuals. This was probably the worst for their character development and mental health. But 3, oftentimes what it means is that you as an athlete need to shoulder the cost. The comparative on our side is that there's more security. Here's how you weigh this. Even if more individuals get into the field on their side, I'm genuinely unsure why that's a net good if they feel far more miserable. On our side, we're able to weed out individuals that won't be successful to the extent in which only the brightest and most elite who can create competitive sports will be in the industry. That's also good because they have economic safety nets. But the third way in which you weigh this is on the abuse argument Sharia gives you, which is to explain why the incentive to call abuse is far better on our side of the house for all of the mechanisms he gave about why there's no direct accountability when it came to tournaments. The reason as to why this was also more important is because A, oftentimes material benefits are like, all right, before I go on, I'll take a POI quickly, even though it's raised at like 5:55.
Okay. If your franchise is owned by like big teams and game developers, you have no scrutiny if a team is unfair or fucks up big team. At least on our side, maybe there's scrutiny in another tournament or another sort of like division.
Yeah. Okay, so you're literally just repeating an assertion you gave in DLO. That's not true for the mechanism I gave you, which is to say higher degrees of viewership in the sport means that it's far easier for you to get accountability, because also when you don't create scrutiny, they just move away and literally you as the developer lose money and stocks in your game, and therefore that's not likely going to be good. Great. Finally then, why is abuse important? This was important for the reason A, because oftentimes abuse is logically prior to a lot of the material benefits, because if you're abused or unable to speak out in the industry, you feel far worse and feel more insecure. But 2, oftentimes it just is a compounding harm, because if you do not call it out preemptively, more victims are harmed in the future, and that's bad. Finally then, what was the last thing Sharia said to you, and why is that important? The first thing I want to point out here is that closing opposition just says, a lot of individuals who get selected are on the basis of, for example, other stuff. I just think that's not true. I think the game is fairly meritocratic. But the second way in which we beat CO is to say, at best, CO proves like more individuals going into the industry is a good thing. I'm genuinely unsure why. Sharia proves to you why a lot of individuals who get weeded out live a better life insofar as they're not in the industry that's going to bound to end in failure. And also oftentimes like you have things, for example, like coaching or other backup roles that are far better on our side of the house to acquiesce. For all those reasons, we propose.
There, Rush, that speech. To wrap up the debate, I'd like to welcome the off-whip. Here.
Hello, can I just confirm that this is clear and audible?
Yep, all good.
All right. For POIs, please use voice. You can interrupt me, but don't badger. I'll be taking you before the 6 minutes. If there are any, preferably please raise a POI in between 5 and 6. I'll take you during that time. Starting my speech, again, POIs through voice. I will not be looking at the chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Now, I think both government teams are so confused with what the franchise model is actually going to look like on their side, right? And that will be evident in my issues in the speech. Two issues in the speech. Firstly, I'll deal with OG, and then secondly, I'll directly respond to CG. In both scenarios, I will weigh our case against opening opposition. Let's deal with opening government, right? Because they say that in a franchise model, it's likely going to be more inclusive because you include more teams from minorities and you give them opportunities because you just need to play good enough. We challenge this from CO, right? Because note that it's not as easy as opening government makes it seem like, because in franchise models, you need to build a reputation as well before you can actually be recognized by private groups. Like the info slide literally tells us private groups buy teams on their side, right? This is bad because the profit-oriented nature of these leagues is likely going to prey off of already prominent players and athletes. So a lot of their harms against opposition bench, such as sponsors not wanting you, actually are worse off on their side, right? Because franchise models only ever select famous and clouty players like Yellow Star, for example, or Bjorgsen. This is exacerbated on their side because if Prime Minister tells us that famous players are used as role models, then the only role models you are likely to get on their side are those with established reputations already. This just proves that one, you do not get Prime Minister's benefit of inclusivity to minority teams, but two, we would even posit that this was asserted by OG because they never mechanized how they provide access to smaller teams to begin with, right? They just said, if you play well, you will be part of a league. That is not a mechanization for their case. What changes, therefore, in closing opposition? We think that on our side, minorities are better off because the absence of, for example, central authority that is likely to select and filter who exactly gets to be a part of a league is something that will be taken advantage of smaller athletes and minority athletes, because now you just simply need, for example, a phone or a good team for you to be able to work with and play with for you to be able to join a regional tournament or a local tournament, which CG tries to tell us is something that is going to be huge in number regardless of the side in this debate, right? So we think that these smaller teams are likely to be better off on our side at a point in which we ensure that these people are on a relatively equal playing field with other athletes. This means my significance and place in the league, for example, isn't going to be contingent on my reputation or my skill level in government side. But I raised a POI, right, that invitations only apply in major tournaments, like there are still regional tournaments. They say that if there's no invitation, there's still going to be a lot of qualifications, like you need to get through a lot of tournaments. This is symmetric because in government bench, you still need to stand out to be recruited anyway, right? But even if they say that regional tournaments on our side are meaningless because you still cannot qualify because all the attention is focused on huge competitions, this is ridiculous because obviously for you to be able to climb up the ladder of the esports industry, you also need to start small. You also need to beat other teams to begin with, right? The next thing I want to deal with coming from OG is this huge lack of understanding of what actually the franchise model is going to look like on their side, because they kept saying that teams will be very skillful, smaller teams can qualify for bigger tournaments, and they will get recognition in government bench. Panel, none of this will happen in OG because in franchise models, and this is in the motion clarifications channel, teams in a certain league are only going to compete against each other, meaning it is the same set of people you will compete against and with for the entire season. This already erases their push against us when Deputy Prime Minister said that opposition eliminates the principle of competition, because the truth is that on their side, you are a debater like me going through 5 rounds with world's finalists nonstop. What is the implication, therefore? Even if there is a smaller team in opening government because they were magically chosen and scouted by a private group, if the other teams in their league are good and famous, that smaller team will never stand a chance. The only standing benefit in OG, therefore, is that you won't be removed from the league, so you are still fine. This is bad because if opening government wants players to feel good about their esports career, they don't get that in OG at a point in which smaller teams feel like shit that they keep losing, but they're still in the league simply because they cannot be relegated. But then opening government tells us that equity rules are going to be better. Nickel questioned this at MO when the quality of the rules and accountability systems and on government bench are likely going to that they are likely to come up with in a franchise model are narratives and agencies where they're only concentrated among the more privileged people, right? So it's a lot less democratic, and it's likely to be the same executives who proliferate the sexist and elitist notions that you are trying to correct in the first place. OG has been largely outcome dependent. Their entire case is hinged on 2 things: more people playing and the central authority being this benevolent actor who prioritizes equity as opposed to profit incentives and chances of success. We've dealt with both of these issues coming from CO. OG is out of this debate. Let's deal with closing government, right? Because
Engagement
they raised a
closing.
POI. why will small teams win if they have smaller resources and lesser time to practice? Several layers of responses. One, you do not need a lot of resources and training. You just need a mobile device or a phone or a computer, and then a good team to work with, which we proved is accessible. When Nickel argued about camaraderie being a value that leagues uphold, but obviously the debate applies to athletes who are already in leagues, and so they likely already have a team and some level of resources to be able to play, right? But secondly, there's diversity of competition. You are only able to compete against different teams from different backgrounds and different skill levels in CO when you have regional tournaments that allow anyone to join, because it is a stepping stone to building your reputation as a league or a team. But thirdly, there is still the incentive to be at the top of the game, because obviously teams care about the league's reputation. In franchise model and government bench, no relegation means underperformance is not punished. So therefore, you breed complacency among these teams that they will still be in that league even if they keep losing their games, right? It comes at the expense of other well-performing teams in that league, which is detrimental to the league because leagues rely on team successes. Before I proceed with more responses to CG, OG. CG. Oh yeah, sure, OG.
How is it possible for the small team to compete on the international commercialized competition if they do not have their previous achievements or a lot of money?
I already explained to you why they need to start small firstly, right? But let's engage with CG, right? Because they said that they don't care about smaller teams. Nickel's contribution was so important, and this is the tie back. Literally, the International Esports Federation is aiming to legitimize esports as a sport, meaning if CG wants to protect the people in the teams, they're protecting the wrong people. Because if they care about the athletes in these teams, they're probably already fine or have some sort of safety net and cushion by virtue of them being in a league. But the smaller teams and athletes that CO wants to protect are more important, because we agree with everyone in the debate. This is about viewership and visibility. But it was only CO who demonstrated to you how the esports industry grows, like having lower barriers to entry, having diversified competition, and making sure that the sport becomes a game of skill and not necessarily a game of reputation. This is better analysis than OO, because they just said that if you get promoted once to a big tournament, that is good enough for you to become like stable, right? That is a massive logical leap, which assumes smaller athletes have a shot in winning. CO was charitable enough to extend that even if we don't succeed, we do not limit the growth of athletes to only the same pools of people. We think that closing government was largely assertive, because I'm quite unsure how exactly on their side it ultimately means that athletes are better off. Like what is the incentive of private entities to scout and support a small, well-performing athlete over a prominent, well-performing athlete, right? For these reasons, CO.
Thank you very much for that speech. Thank you everyone for the debate. The class will debaters please leave the breakout room, head back to the main room. Adjudicators stay in here for deliberation, and we'll be back in about 15 minutes or so. Thanks, everybody. All right, now it's actually recording again. Thank you everyone for the debate. Well done on what was a pretty good debate for round two. I'm feeding through another esports motion from Milosh. Let's start with some general feedback, the result, and then the reasons for the result. A couple of things in general feedback. I think at times this debate kind of it needed to just go back to the basics of a sports debate. I know it's esports, real sports, it all sort of comes down to the same sort of things of like, how do we best look after the athletes? How do we get the most fan engagement? And like the things that we need to get that involved, like money, promotion, advertising, etc. And often those things also overlap with economics debates. You know, how do we get the most customers? How do we get the market our brand most successfully? So trying to bring it back a lot more to those basics, I think would have helped teams generate a lot more argumentation in today's debate about the best ways that this league could run. The second thing is I think teams need to do a bit more work to try and characterize what the two alternatives were in this debate. So there were a few assertions or ideas thrown around about like these people who control each league, but who are these people? What are their incentives? How they're likely to operate? So teams that tried to do that a bit better did better in the debate. But there's a lot more space to characterize as to who the private owners of these franchises might be, or how they're likely to operate, what their incentives are. Could really paint a far clearer picture for the debate about how things are likely to operate. I just see we've had someone else come back in. I was just doing general feedback. Everyone said they were back. Sorry. But yeah, otherwise, and the last thing is just everyone needs to make sure they are taking and offering POIs. There weren't as many POIs taken and offered in this debate as there should have been. In terms of the results then, we eventually came to a consensus decision, with the first going to closing government, the second going to closing opposition, the third going to opening opposition, and the fourth going to opening government. Let's step through the reasons why that decision is the way it is. Let's start with closing government and why they get the first in the debate today. I think closing government makes a number of really important contributions to the debate that both, I think, substantially extend from their opening, but also do a good job of responding to the op bench. I think the first thing that they do is with regards to the like investment that these esports are likely to receive and why that is likely to be stronger in a franchise model. Mechanisms they give are things around like the trust in the developer, the viewership because you have regular teams and people you can root for, etc. And thirdly, and I think this also sort of both supports the previous two mechanisms and is benefited by the previous two mechanisms, is you just able to get a lot more money funneled into the league as a consequence. So you can you can fund the league more, but also the league is able to generate more revenue as a consequence of this, which means that overall I think the league ends up being a bit better than what it is likely to be on a qualification level, which responds to claims that are made by both off-bench teams. I think the second thing that they do well is also tie that into how individual athletes are banned, which sorry, not banned, are benefited, which is probably a useful new contribution they make at Extension around the benefits of having more money in a franchise model, and also less fear around things like relegation, etc., to make the playing experience a lot better, which I think also responds to some claims made from opening opposition, for example, around how relegation is exciting for the fans, possibly, but it's also harmful for the players, and given the fans are also likely to be satisfied by having a stronger competition, they were able to outweigh that argument. The third thing I think they do well in Extension is respond to this idea around scrutiny, which is particularly important in responding, I guess, both developing from opening gun, but also responding to OO around the way in which this sport is likely to, like, who can you complain to? There was talks about equity, etc. I think they talk about, like, what we found compelling from them was the fact that there is one central authority running a franchise, and it's far easier to hold them responsible because they do control everything rather than a number of multiple different individuals from different leagues. And responses around, well, if you've got a small league, you can just go elsewhere. Well, someone from Tab is here. Hello, Isa. What have we done wrong?
Hi, I just have a discrepancy with your panel, but I will chat them on Zoom. Okay, I will chat with the panel. You can keep going. Okay.
Okay, no worries. Thanks, Isa. All right, so where were we? Scrutiny, yeah. So because it's one central authority, you are able to do it, and also because there is lots of viewership, lots of sponsorship involved, means there's likely to be a lot of accountability to that group. The last one then, the last section we think that CG provides to help them win the debate is this question around small teams. So that is obviously a big part of the debate from all teams, and how small teams are able to access the bigger leagues, etc. I think what CG is able to do is sort of like, maybe all the teams that make it up there, maybe there's some issues around like full accessibility, but there's so much scouting likely to be involved. And that means that all the like good players that come from junior training events and other smaller places will still be able to get a go. And that sort of, I think, answers the big questions from the off-bench teams around like people being able to have access to the sport. I think they do provide, like, the reason they give around the idea that like franchises just want good players, they want the young talent to come through, is pretty compelling in terms of the incentives of those franchises who want to win, who want to be popular. I think, which means they're likely to try and target new talent rather than just the conception of like they'll just stick with like already good players or just stick with what they've got, as opposed to actually sorry, 1 second, just the ballot thing again. All right. Yeah, rather than trying to figure out new talent. So those couple of areas of extension, which we think are able to get CG up over the rest of the teams in the debate. When we look at CO then and why they take the second in the debate, I think they make a valiant attempt to respond to those claims, particularly at WIP when they try and take down the government bench. But I think on the areas that we talked about, quality of the sport, around investment and around the scrutiny, etc., closing government is able to get up. When we look at the second and third split then between CO and OO, we think that CO does add a number of things to the OO case, which make the case a bit stronger from the op bench and do provide some more responsiveness. So I think they firstly have a few more responses around accessibility, but they also, I think, add in a lot more incentives and characterization around the way in which these the franchises are likely to operate, and how they talk about who is likely to be pulled in, etc., which I think adds a lot more characterization that is sorely needed from the opening opposition team. I think the third thing they do is also you extend on ideas around profit, etc., and why those things are particularly important. Whereas I think when we compare to the opening opposition team, I think they fall a bit short in terms of just like the depth and significance of the analysis, and maybe get a bit too caught up in just this idea around like poor teams don't have the money to get in. We think that CO, by adding that an extra analysis around the qualification process themselves, do a good job on extending above their opening team. Yes, let's look at the top half then and the 3-4 split. So I think there's a couple of clashes here in which it is close, but the opening opposition is ultimately able to get up. I think the first one is around this question of accessibility again. I think the big problem with the opening government case is it's really uncomparative in terms of how these teams are likely to operate. So when they're talking about, stability, etc., for these teams, there's a big question of comparative rather, which is what I was able to point out. So they would talk about the fact that small teams are never going to have the money to buy into franchise, never going to actually get a chance to be promoted, etc., which means that in terms of entering, they're all unlikely to be successful. I think the second area of the money is around partnerships, where OG claims that partnerships are likely to be easier to get when you have like a franchise recognition. However, I think OO provides good analysis to suggest why there's still be incentives to sponsor up and coming teams in the qualification model that are doing well and that are winning tournaments. So I think they mitigate that response. I think also they do a good defense of the idea around relegation. Obviously that is outweighed later on, but at least in the top half, I think the relegation aspect is done well by OO when talking about how that adds like a bit of excitement for fans, but also inspires better performance from teams that are on the cusp of either being promoted up or relegated down, which means you get better gameplay and more exciting outcomes. And then, which is also the second clash in the top half around the quality of that game. The third thing I think is in the top half is around stuff around like equity and who to report to. I think given the amount of time and analysis spent on this, is probably the secondary issue in the top half. And for me, it was more decided around accessibility. This is probably where the panel had a bit more discussion around what was the most important in the top half. Ultimately, I thought the opening government team does provide some reasoning around why equity is important and more likely to be reportable here. But I think the responses given by Offbench around how there's still going to be some structure in these tournaments, there's still going to be some competitive nature between these tournaments. That means you're still likely to want to have a degree of equity as well. I think what they're also able to do in the top half is show that there isn't really an equity, it's a broader equity issue around accessibility that is made worse by something like franchising rather than by the qualification model. All right, that concludes the 08. Sorry, it was a bit disjointed and disrupted by the ballot issues. If anyone has any questions or like any feedback, please feel free to reach out to me on Discord and Rahul as well. I will try and get back to you before the rounds tomorrow, but it probably won't be immediately this afternoon. Otherwise, congratulations on a good debate today and best of luck for the rest of the tournament.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Where do we contact you for the feedback?
Yeah, just hit me up on Discord and I'll get back to you guys.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Thanks, everyone. Rahul, do you know what the ballot issue was? Did it get resolved?
Yeah, it was a speaker order between Ted and Shorya that's been rectified. Thank you.
Too easy. No worries. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you.